This video lecture covers chemical reactions. Support for the development of this lesson has been provided by the National Science Foundation through the Ohio University Boat of Knowledge in the Science Classroom program. What happens when we combine hydrogen peroxide, dish soap, water, some food coloring, and yeast? We form a foamy substance that's called elephant's toothpaste. But what's actually happening? Elephant's toothpaste is the result of a chemical reaction that involves the decomposition of hydrogen peroxide into water and oxygen. Chemical reactions are expressed using numbers, symbols, and formulas. These expressions are called chemical equations. What do these numbers and symbols mean? The symbols identify the substances that are undergoing the chemical reaction, and the numbers tell us how many atoms or molecules of each substance are involved in the reaction. Chemical equations help us understand what happens during a chemical reaction. On the left side of the chemical equation, we have the substances that we start with. These are called the reactants, which will undergo a change during the chemical reaction. In this example, we have two reactants, hydrogen and oxygen. These substances react to form a product, in this case water, which is shown on the right side of the equation. This chemical equation tells us that 2H2 combines with 1O2 to form two H2O molecules. The coefficients tell us the number of molecules of each substance, and the subscripts tell us how many atoms of each element are present. If the coefficient or subscript is 1, it is not written out. Not all chemical reactions involve the combination of two substances to form a new substance. This certainly wasn't the case with the elephant toothpaste, where the hydrogen peroxide broke down into water and oxygen. There are actually 5 types of chemical reactions that can occur. The elephant toothpaste is an example of a decomposition, where a compound breaks down. If 2 or more substances combine to form a new substance, it's called a synthesis. We can also have combustions, where a hydrogen or hydrocarbon burns an oxygen, like what happens when we drive our car or burn wood. The last 2 types of chemical reactions we can have are single and double replacements. In a single replacement, one element takes the place of another element in a compound. In a double replacement, the elements in 2 compounds switch places. We can tell what type of reaction is taking place by looking at the chemical equation. If we have only one reactant, then we know we're looking at a decomposition reaction. The reactant, which will be a compound like AB, will break down into its elements A and B. If we have only one product, then the chemical reaction is a synthesis. The reactants A and B combine to form a new substance, AB. The key to identifying a combustion reaction is to notice that oxygen is a reactant and water is a product. The chemical equation for a single replacement will always have one element and one compound on each side of the equation, but the elements and compounds on the left side will be different from those on the right side. We can see the replacement occurs when A switches with B. Double replacements are very similar to single replacements, except we're dealing with 2 compounds instead of a compound and an element. For this double replacement, we see that elements B and D switched places to form 2 new compounds on the right side of the equation. When we look at any of the chemical equations, we'll notice one thing that all the equations have in common. The number of atoms for each element on the left side equals the number of atoms for that same element on the right side. In other words, the equation is balanced. Let's look at this chemical equation and count the number of atoms of each element to see if it's balanced. Remember that the coefficient tells us how many molecules there are, and the subscript tells us the number of atoms. On the left side, we have 2 copper nitrate molecules. Each molecule has 1 copper atom and 2 nitrates. The nitrate is made of 1 nitrogen atom and 3 oxygen atoms. So if we have 2 nitrates, as indicated by the subscript 2, that means we have 2 nitrogen atoms and 6 oxygen atoms in this copper nitrate molecule. But since we have 2 molecules of copper nitrate, we have double the number of atoms that would be in one molecule. That means we have 2 copper atoms, 4 nitrogen atoms, and 12 oxygen atoms on the left side of the equation. If we follow the same process on the right side of the equation, we have 2 copper atoms from the first compound and 4 nitrogen atoms from the second compound. To count up all of the oxygen atoms, we have 2 from the first compound, 8 from the second compound, and 2 from the oxygen molecule, which gives us a total of 12 oxygen atoms. So this equation is balanced. We know that all chemical equations are balanced, but why does this happen? The answer is the law of conservation of matter, which says that matter cannot be created or destroyed. That means we can't lose or gain any atoms during a chemical reaction. Since we know chemical equations must be balanced, how do we go about balancing an equation? The first step is to count the number of atoms of each element on each side of the equation. If we look at our example, starting with the left side of the equation, we have 1 iron, 2 hydrogens, 1 sulfur, and 4 oxygens. On the right side of the equation, we have 2 irons, 2 hydrogens, 3 sulfurs, and 12 oxygens. Now we need to identify which elements do not have the same number of atoms on both sides of the equation. For our example, the iron, sulfur, and oxygen atoms are not equal. Now that we know which elements have unequal numbers of atoms, we can start balancing the equation. We'll start with an element that's part of a compound and add a coefficient that will give us the correct number of atoms. Let's start with sulfur. We have 1 atom on the left side, but we need 3 atoms to be balanced with the right side. If we put a coefficient of 3 in front of the hydrogen sulfate, we get 3 atoms of sulfur. But anytime we include a coefficient in front of a molecule, we change the number of atoms for all the elements that are part of that molecule. That means we also need to recount the number of hydrogen and oxygen atoms on the left side. Now we have 6 hydrogens, 3 sulfurs, and 12 oxygens on the left side. Now we look again at which elements are not balanced. The oxygen and sulfur atoms on both sides are equal now, but the iron and hydrogen need to be balanced. We need 2 iron atoms on the left side of the equation, so we'll put a coefficient of 2 in front of the Fe. Now everything is balanced except the hydrogen atoms. We need 6 atoms on the right side, and we only have 2. We can put a coefficient of 3 in front of the H2 on the right side of the equation, and now the equation is balanced. Let's review some of the concepts we just covered. In this chemical equation, what are the reactants, products, coefficients, and subscripts? Take a moment to decide. Remember that the reactants are on the left side of the equation, and they are the substances that are being altered. The products, which are the substances being formed, are on the right side of the equation. The coefficients are the numbers in front of the molecules, and the subscripts are the small numbers that come after an element symbol. Now let's try labeling each chemical equation with the correct reaction type. Take a few minutes to write your answers now. In the first equation, sodium and water react to form sodium hydroxide and hydrogen. We have an element and a compound forming a new element and compound, so this is a single replacement. In the second equation, sulfur and oxygen combine to form sulfur dioxide. We have 2 reactants and 1 product, so this is a synthesis. The third equation is hydrogen chloride and sodium hydroxide reacting to form sodium chloride and water. We have 2 compounds on each side of the equation, and we can see that the sodium and hydrogen switched places, so this is a double replacement. In the fourth equation, calcium carbonate breaks down into calcium oxide and carbon dioxide. We have 1 reactant and 2 products, so we know this must be a decomposition. Finally, in the last equation, ethane and oxygen react to form carbon dioxide and water. Since we have a hydrocarbon and oxygen for reactants, and water is one of the products, this is a combustion. For more practice with balancing equations, visit the website shown. To reinforce the concepts covered in this lesson, you can complete these 3 activities. Through these activities, you can practice identifying chemical reactions and balancing equations.